At this time, I would like to introduce our panelists. We have Dr. David Crossley. He is a professor of geophysics in the Department of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at St. Louis University. He has spent 37 years teaching global geophysics. Applied geophysics is Earth unique and sustainable energy. His research interests are in the Earth's gravity field, global Earth structure, and more recently, Earth's resources and the approaching global energy crisis. We also have with us meteorologist Mike Roberts from KSDK, who was on the air an hour ago. He's with KSDK News Channel 5, and he joined KSD in 1996. Prior to that, he worked at KSHD TV in Kansas City, KMOV TV here in St. Louis, and WOWT TV in Omaha, Nebraska. Mike has won many Emmys for Best Weathercaster in 2004, 2006, 2007, and 2008. And earned the American Meteorological Society's Certified Broadcast Meteorologist Seal of Approval in 2008. In addition to his responsibilities at KSDK, he is an adjunct professor at St. Louis University in the Department of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences. Very good. And with us on our connection is Dr. Richard Alley, who we just saw in the film. He is a professor of geosciences and associate of the Earth and Environmental Science Systems Institute at Penn State University. He studies the great ice sheets to aid in prediction of future changes in climate and sea level, and has conducted 3 field sessions in Antarctica, 8 in Greenland, and 3 in Alaska. You must really enjoy cold weather. With over 225 scientific publications, he has provided requested advice to numerous government officials in multiple administrations, including a U.S. Vice President, the President's Science Advisor, and committees and individual members of the U.S. Senate and House of Representatives. At this time, I'd like to invite our panelists to give an initial statement if they wish. We'll start with Dr. Crossley.
Okay, there we go. Thank you very much for inviting me here. I'm pleased to be part of this event and to meet my colleague Mike Roberts from the same department. I've been teaching sustainable energy this semester, and we just finished doing an analysis of some of the green communities. Including SAMSO. So the first thing I'm going to do when I get this film is go and show it to my class, because I think it's really worthwhile. So that's the first comment. Since I'm an academic, I probably would go on too long, but I just want to make a couple of remarks here which try and help fill in with the sense of the film. First of all, when we talk about sustainability, we have to think in time periods of hundreds to thousands of years if we're going to survive. So the 5 to 10 year or 20-year cycle of plans will do in the interim, but we really need very long-term solutions for this problem. And we have no solutions at the moment for decreasing population. It's not a very popular topic to decrease population. So the question of trying to deal with rising population and rising energy at the same time is really a very tough one. I wanted to point out that physics, which is my subject, has no magic solutions for solving the energy crisis. That is, some of the esoteric things that you may have read about, such as antimatter and vacuum energy and other things, simply are not on the table. The physics would emphasize that we already have the solution to the energy problem, and that is to use the sun, exactly as what's put into the film. So those people who are saying science will come up with some solution, well, it's certainly not on the table. The only possible solution that would give us a lot of energy is fusion. and that is going to be something that we don't know how that's going to work out. I wanted to point out something about green communities and the attempts for these groups, such as you heard about in Texas, saw about in Texas, to provide sustainable energy for their communities. What they've been able to do in the best cases, and these are very, very good starts, is to provide enough energy to get off the grid, that is, to supply their own power. And you often hear in the film about trying to find energy that will power so many homes. The real problem, though, is that the power we use for homes is only about 1/4 to 1/5 of the power that we actually use ourselves. The power that we need as a society to function in the industrial complex and to provide all the goods and services is far, far greater than the amount of energy we need just to power our houses. So powering our houses is a good start, but it doesn't address the bigger problem, how the society is going to provide the overwhelming amount of energy that goes in through the industrial complex. And it's kind of, in St. Louis here, we have the start of a situation in which people are getting subsidies for solar panels on their homes. And it's rather interesting that this experiment has only been in place for a very short time. Already Maryville is complaining that it's so successful that they're actually afraid that the subsidies they're giving are cutting into their own profits, because Amarin has, of course, to buy back energy. This is a solution, this is a system that has been in place very successfully. But even in Europe, where they've really gone full tilt for this renewable energy in places like Germany, they are running up against the same problem. In other words, that the traditional utility companies are starting to find that if consumers produce their own wind and solar energy and sell them back to the grid, that's going to cut into their investors' profits. The other thing I want to finish out by saying is that there is a window of opportunity here. From the point of view of physics, we need to bootstrap ourselves up to a sustainable economy while we can. And that means we have a lot of cheap oil still around. And what we're doing right now is using cheap oil to find expensive oil. That is oil that comes from fracking, or gas that comes from fracking. And that's really not maybe a very good way to use the oil we have now. What we should really be using the oil for is to try and bootstrap ourselves up to a society which is going to be sustainable from an energy point of view. And that basically means turning our whole system into something that can use electricity, because solar and wind power generates electricity, as hydro does. But we have not in the US done very well on electrifying our transportation systems, for example. Okay, my steadiness, thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Alley.
Yeah, well, pleasure to see you. Am I coming through okay?
You're fine.
Good, glad to hear it. I apologize that I couldn't come be with you, but think of this as being on the cutting edge. We are saving a lot of energy with the science here at Penn State, and I got to talk with my students today. Talking about the same materials that you just saw in the TV show. The comments you just heard there were spot on. The sun, the wind ultimately is stable. We can get there. They supply far more energy we need. We have not been trying very hard. Government research on energy has been tiny compared to other things. But all the government research on energy, it has grossly been dominated by fission, fusion, and fossil fuels. All of the renewables together over sort of the last 30 years have gotten less attention than fossil fuels have. We've had government in many places put renewables out of business. Right after World War I, there was an industry growing of wind connected to batteries for rural electrification. And we said, no, we're going to use coal and hydro and wires to do rural electrification. And the government essentially put that nascent industry out of business. subsidizing renewables. We have a window that we can change that.
Thank you very much. Mike.
Well, I'm at the end of the information process when it comes to meteorology. I get my facts together, I look at the atmosphere top to bottom, I make a forecast and try to get my viewers acclimated to what's coming tonight, tomorrow, the next 7 days, maybe a season ahead. But my job is also to alert my public. And we're ready, so as many of you as want to watch, I'd be grateful. That's no problem. Is to warn them when there's something out there that they need to know that could be putting them in harm's way. We just had an example of that on Sunday. And so, I know we're seeing climate change now in real time. Research is catching up to the extent where it can support some of that conclusion. But my concern is that if we wait until we have categorical proof for every portion of this discussion, and let's face it, the overwhelming amount of research points us in this direction anyway, it's going to be too late. We'll have crossed several tipping points. And you don't have to look too far. Right over on that screen over there, you're going to see job growth. We did a climate change special in September, and I talked to retired Admiral David Titman, who was the oceanographer for the U.S. Navy, and did research for them projecting how sea level is going to change in this century. Well, he really wasn't, 10 years ago, completely on board with this whole notion of climate change. By the time he finished that research, he's forecasting 3 to 6 foot sea level rise for the Navy. He was asked, well, why should we care? He said, we're the Navy. And the head of the Pacific Fleet right now, the current head of the Pacific Fleet right now, speaking in Boston in the spring, was asked, well, what's your biggest concern long term? This is on the heels of the Chinese hacking into military computers. He said, climate change. And you just have to think about that typhoon that just happened in the Philippines. Haiyan. You have research that supports that Sandy wasn't entirely sponsored by climate change. But the warm water, warmer than it used to be, made it stronger. So we're seeing climate change in real time. And as the point person, or one of the point people, whose job it is to bring you, because let's face it, I'm a meteorologist. When it comes to climatology, I'm a reporter. But to bring my audience, my public, what I think they need to know to be out of harm's way, I think this is the most important issue that I've been faced with in 34 years. And on a personal level, I feel like it's incumbent upon those of us who are doing what we do to speak to the issue, regardless of whatever blowback might come. Because at the end of this career, and my business could end next month, I want to be able to say, I raised my hand. And so that's why I'm here. I think it's time to act. That was a fantastic piece we just heard. And I will say, you'll notice this, and this happened with our climate change special. Cindy and I went back and, we were on social media responding to people emailing us and Twittering us and Facebooking us. And really, what we heard from were the people wide to the left and wide to the right. We didn't hear really from anybody in the middle. And I feel like that's because that's where a lot of people are already. In the media, at least, I think we're a little bit late to this discussion. But it's time. It's time to talk openly. Really, not so much about the issue itself, but what we're going to do about it.
Thank you, Mike. At this time, I'd like to invite members of the audience to come forward to the microphone and ask questions. I would discourage you from making remarks, but instead ask questions directly to our panelists. So please come up to the microphone. We need the microphone so that Dr. Alley can hear us clearly. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Larry Lazar. Thank you all again for coming. I appreciate it. Recently, some prominent climate scientists, including Ken Caldera, James Hansen, and a few others, asked the environmental movement to kind of back off on nuclear and its role in society, saying that we need nuclear. There's a risk, but the risk of climate change is much greater than the risk of nuclear issues. So could you comment, or what's take that?
Nuclear is right in the middle of being a technology which is semi-sustainable. It's something that can be the bridge between the fossil fuels and the real renewables. And I think if you throw it out of the equation at the start, then you face a much tougher transition in terms of what you're going to do. So it's assessing risks is really a difficult thing to do. As I'm in a department which tries to assess earthquake risk, and we know that's really a tricky thing to do. So what is the greater risk? And for those of you, of course, who know about Fukushima, it was actually not the earthquake that made the problem. It was the tsunami which followed, and that was the problem. Japan is in a situation where they initially said they were not going to continue with nuclear power. But the government has changed, and now they're reconsidering whether they should go back in to nuclear. So I think nuclear is, to me, it's a very viable option, and may even be necessary for countries to enable them to make a transition. The one thing that nuclear can do for you is provide continuous energy when the wind does not blow and the sun does not shine. And that's something which is not addressed in the film, but it's an important part of the equation, is how are you going to produce continuous energy? And nuclear is one of those systems that has that ability.
We've temporarily lost Dr. Alley, so we'll see. Mike, do you want to comment?
I think it's interesting that on the heels of what happened in Japan, the Japanese just announced a couple of days ago that they are going to pull back completely from any promises they made to reduction of greenhouse gases because they're struggling in the wake of Fukushima. And I guess my point is we have to be prepared for this not to necessarily be an easy journey, which means I think our level of commitment to change has to really be up there. But let's face it, the 20th century we had in this country was because we were the first to really take advantage of oil. Whoever wins the green battle, they win the battle for the 21st century. You know, and I did a lot of research for our climate special. I was really stunned by how many military folks, how many branches of the military have an official position on this. There's a Pentagon study that shows global conflict is going to increase in direct proportion to a decrease in the availability of fresh water. I mentioned what the Admiral's concerns were. I heard a term that I'd not heard before, climate refugee. If you have a cataclysmic event like that, it's happening right here, that event in a marginally stable or unstable political environment could destabilize the entire region because it creates refugees who flee into other marginally stable places, and now you have problems. And our forest may be the best example of that. Dry up the lake, people kill each other.
Well, we're still trying to get Dr. Alley back, and when he comes back, I'll ask him to address that same question. Do we have somebody else? Yes, sir.
Yes, Mr. Roberts, I understand the meteorological community might be a little bit split on this subject. I understand one of your rivals in this town doesn't believe that climate change is as real as most of us perhaps in this audience. So like your comments there, if we had the televised guest, I'd like to see him answer. I understand it's 97% of climate scientists that don't believe that climate change is real, global warming is occurring.
Well, and it's funny, I was talking to Dirk beforehand. I just think you got to go forward. People are where they are on the issue, and you just have to go forward. If they're with you, fine. If they're not, fine. But you have to go forward.
Dr. Crossley? Okay, we have another question, please.
My name is Randy Weber, and I was just curious about your thoughts on fracking and its impact on the earth. To me, that seems like it might be doing more damage than good, but it appears to be expanding so much in our country.
Yes, well, fracking is something that, as most of you know, is going ahead full steam in the U.S. Most countries don't have the ability to do this. So it's particularly something that the U.S. is able to do for a number of reasons. First of all, the oil industry has been very strong, as Mike mentioned, over the last century. So they know where the oil was, and fracking is simply a question of going back into the same areas and splitting apart the formations and pushing out the remaining, what they think is the remaining oil and gas. And as you point out, it's a very environmentally, I would say, suspicious activity. It takes a huge amount of water. It doesn't go down as clean water, and they're trying to make it clean. I don't want to make any value judgments about it. What I will say, though, is that what we know about the longevity of these fracking wells is that they're fairly short-lived. They don't last more than maybe a few years of production, and then you have to find more and more and more.
I'd like to ask you a question. Don't you think fracking is, on some level, a sign of desperation?
Well, it's what the oil companies do. I mean, they have the expertise, they know how to do it. They are in business to stay in business. I mean, their interest is to maintain their industry, and I think it's, from some point of view, it's natural for them to try and extend what they do to the limits that they can do it, and fracking is an example of that. And all kinds of other drilling on offshore areas and so on. Maybe some of us see it as a sign of desperation, but honestly, I think they are doing what they feel they're best able to do. And I think it's up to, let's say, the government to step in and say, wait a minute, if you're going to do fracking, we have to make sure the EPA, for example, is on board with making sure that this is something that's being done with some responsibility.
I loved the interview that they had with the former oil executive, the guy from Shell, and has some pretty strong opinions, but I do feel like you're prolonging the inevitable. Here's the thing. Being a wealthy man, it's okay for me to have an opinion, I suppose, but I will say this: if you're an investor, do you really, as long as it's within certain ethical boundaries, do you really care how you make a nice return on your investment? If you're an oil company, or if you're a company whose product is grown in a place that's going to be displaced by a change in the climate, don't you want the people who are running that company to have enough corporate direction to foresee the changes that are coming 10 and 50 and maybe 70 years down the road? If I had a large share of investment in an oil company, but I thought the people running that were on the cutting edge of green technology and had a very good chance of being in on a real revolution economically, I'd be a happy investor. I mean, let's face it, once they found out that they could make a lot of money off producing gasoline for automobiles, in 1913, there weren't very many gas stations, but by 1940, they were all over the place. Once you demonstrate that the product will sell, that people will use it, the lid's off. And so I think it is in our own sort of national security interests to win the battle of green technology, to be out ahead of the pack. I think there's no small coincidence here that the Chinese are so heavily interested in this. They want to be the winner of the green revolution.
Welcome back, Dr. Alley. Sorry we lost you there for a minute. We had two questions while you were gone, one about nuclear power and one about fracking.
Yep, okay, so if I can chime in just a little bit. With the fracking first, if fracking is used to get gas that reduces coal, it allows you to do a lot more renewables. There are situations now that a coal plant, once it's turned on, just has to run. You can't change the level of electricity coming out of the coal plant very much for a day or two. And so you would have to turn off the wind turbines and pay for money to run coal if demand is low. If you go to natural gas, a gas turbine can spin up real fast, and so then you can add a lot more renewables. But as you were saying there's a question of best practices. Is the gas being recovered in a way that is careful and thorough? And I'll tell you a story. About 3 years ago, when they started doing a lot of fracking up the road from me here in Pennsylvania, the local newspaper talked to the barracks of the highway patrol about the fracking industry. And the highway patrol barracks person said, it's getting better. He said, last year, when we stopped a truck associated with the industry, we had to take more than half of them off of the road because the truck or the driver was too dangerous to let them drive away from the stop. And he said, this year it's below half. Now, it's a good question. If half of the trucks are too dangerous to drive away, are we absolutely sure that everything else is being done by best practices? I'll let you fill that in. Back to the nuclear question. I think what you heard there was absolutely accurate, but I'll add something to nuclear that it right now probably has bigger contradictions than anything else we deal with. And there's almost certainly a whole lot of fence mending and getting along before there'll be a lot of nuclear. One of the things about nuclear, you may have met people who say, we should do nuclear, and we should bomb their nuclear before they make bombs with it. It is very, very hard to have a huge amount of nuclear in the world if we do it, but we bomb theirs. It is also, nuclear relies on the government more than any other energy form. Because nuclear, the long-term and catastrophic insurance are carried by the government. An insurance company really doesn't want to insure even the very slight chance that the county will be uninhabitable for the next year or two. And so if the damage is above some level, the government takes over the insurance. Without that, nuclear is not an economically viable thing, I believe. Furthermore, if you're talking about isolating the waste for 100,000 years, the government carries that, not the industry. So if you like nuclear, you love big government. And my experience is that those two things don't go together.
Thank you very much. Another question, please.
Hi, my name is Andy Knott. I work on energy issues here in Missouri for the Sierra Club, and I'm going to ask your opinions on energy storage. There's a statement earlier about the wind doesn't always blow, the sun doesn't always shine. Earlier this week, I had a conversation with the CEO of a company in Kansas called Wind So High, and they're developing a solution that would involve wind farms, compressing air, storing that compressed air underground in geologic formations so that you can release it when the wind isn't blowing and generate electricity. And there's actually going to be another company is developing a 300 megawatt plant like this in Texas is going to open up in the next year or so. So I just want to get your ideas on energy storage.
Yeah, that's a very good point. The Spanish government knows those projects have thought about that. One of their solutions is to have hot sodium salt water heated up and then used later on as a source of energy. But trying to store energy is really a hard thing to do in a big scale. And it's especially difficult if you're in the prairies where there's a lot of wind farms because it's flat. And one of the best ways to do that is to actually get energy back is to use a pumped water storage, as you may know. That works fine in the mountains in the place where you have elevation differences. You pump water up, like the Tom Sauk Reservoir in southern Missouri was an example where they stored water up there. And then they could let it out later to turn some turbines. But yes, it's really a big problem. And I think one idea about this is that if we're going to do this nationally, we're going to have a national energy grid that is really efficient, so that we can transport energy through the grid from places where the sun is shining and places where the wind is blowing. So I think this whole question of building an infrastructure that can transport energy much more efficiently. For example, DC transmission lines are more efficient than AC transmission lines. That's something that really needs to be looked at in terms of building long-term structure.
Dr. Alley.
Yeah, if I could add to that, a perfect answer. One of the fascinating possibilities is that if we go to plug-in hybrids for our cars, so there's a little biodiesel or something on board of your car as a liquid fuel, and you have a battery that will drive it. If you've got a smart enough grid and you're plugged into it, if the wind dies, the grid can buy a little electricity out of your battery. And when the wind comes up, it can put it back into your battery. And an estimate was that if 3% of the vehicle fleet was plugged in and under contract, you could stabilize a grid that was half renewables, more of the fleet, more renewables. And when the vehicle gets old, when the battery is going downhill, it's not yet dead. You can take those old batteries, rack them up in big buildings, and use those as storage. And if we electrify, as you said earlier, if we electrify more, and part of the electrification is the transportation, we are buying a lot of batteries. And that gives us an additional lever for storage in addition to the hot sodium and the pumped air and the pumped water. We have not tried very hard on storage yet, and I think we'll see a lot of advance in that fairly soon.
Mike?
This is out of my depths. I'm excited though. I'm excited that we're going forward.
We have another question. Yes, sir.
Yes, my name is Brian Etling, and I do climate change presentations in the St. Louis area. And it's great to see you again, Dr. Alley. I got to see you in San Francisco at AGU a couple years ago present. And my question is for you, Mike Roberts. You said something really fascinating before. You said, I know we are seeing climate change in real time. Were you referring to St. Louis about that?
I think globally. I think
Just
you see it here in St. Louis. Let's face it, these are not your grandfather's winters. I think anecdotal evidence is something that the good doctors here are trying to stay away from. But at some point, you just have to acknowledge this is just not what we grew up with. You know, the winters that I have here in St. Louis are not the winters that I grew up with. But I think there's enough evidence to support. You know, a few years ago, maybe 12 months ago, you've been told, well, you can't connect a 6 You know that the home runs went up enormously during that steroid era. But what you can't do is you can't take a home run in the 7th inning of a game in 2004 and say that home run was directly related to steroids. But we can actually, tell that a warmer climate is enhancing storms. And they actually have been able, and correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Alley, but they were looking at the drought of 2010 in Texas. They've been able to connect the dots between that and climate change. And we do know that Sandy was stronger because was influenced by climate change. Would it happen anyway? I taught when we were looking at the 2012 drought, I talked to a gentleman from the National Center for Atmospheric Research, and he said, you know, natural variability is really the cause of the drought, but it was made worse by climate change. That drought just exploded across the country. And so that's what we're seeing. We're seeing things that happen anyway due to natural variability enhanced by the surplus heat in the atmosphere. You know, the way the atmosphere resolves a surplus in heat is often through storms.
Do the other analogy of the loaded dice. If you play dice with somebody, they might roll double sixes, and they might roll double sixes, and they might roll double sixes, and then you realize that they filed the corners off and there's a little extra lead on one side. And yeah, and what we're doing now is we're loading the dice, and we're actually adding another side, a 7 essentially. It's a little, we get more high ones, we're very clearly seeing more record highs, fewer record lows. We're very clearly seeing the most intense rainfall being more intense. We're seeing spreading of the subtropical dry zones. And those are, the evidence is good at this point.
I shouldn't do this, but I'll go kind of off the top of my head because we were looking at this last summer, and I'm pretty sure that the last record low, we had a record low last year. Before that, the previous record low was in September of 2008. And in that same length of time, we had something like 35 record highs.
Other question?
Hi, it's me again, sorry. So I have kids, like many of you, and I try to think of, you know, what it's going to be like when they're my age. I'm 50, and my son, my oldest, is 20. So I try to think of, first off, everything I've seen says that the whole within 2 degrees warming globally would have to be flat, basically zero emissions by 2050. Is that true? And what is kind of a path to get to zero by 250?
Who wants to take that on?
It's going to be hard to get to zero by 2050, given that we haven't tried all that hard yet. Like I say, the policy position now is probably that we're still working to accelerate global warming because there's more subsidies for fossil fuels than there are for renewables. So we could do it, but we'd have to get started very soon. The optimistic thing would be that dealing with climate change is a little like saving for retirement. All delay is costly, but it helps whenever you start. And so if you look at the damages of climate change, the first degree doesn't cost very much. There are winners and there are losers. The next degree of warming costs more than the first one. The next degree costs more than the second one. And pretty soon you start to get to these really scary things where it's very, very expensive. So the world doesn't end at 2 degrees. It gets worse at 2 degrees, and it gets worse at 3. And so if we don't make zero emissions by 2050, if we're on track to drop them, we're going to miss the worst of the disaster.
Okay. Another question? Oh, there's this gentleman back here was standing.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Didn't see you.
Along the lines of this previous question, I've been concerned for a while. When I see everything even at 0.8 degrees increase centigrade. And when I see us approaching, even at that point, approaching all the tipping points that we're approaching at 0.8 degrees centigrade, I hear this talk of needing to keep it at 2 degrees, and I think, what in the world are they talking about? How in the world could that be safe? How in the world could that keep us from crossing over these tipping points that are so dangerous and that could lead to runaway climate change?
I mean, that's my concern, runaway climate change. And I think that there's just no question we're going to have to live with certain consequences of the warming that's already taken place and which will surely take place. And I don't mean to be pessimistic, but I think I'm just being realistic. We can't even get our own Congress to work together so that they can pay their own federal employees. What are the chances they're all going to suddenly get on board with this notion that we need to reduce global greenhouse gases no matter what and come up with a defined policy and maintain that policy and stick to it regardless of who's in office, Republican or Democrat as the president, right? But you're here. And we are talking about it. And the little special that we did at Channel 5 did okay in the ratings. I think people are listening. So what I loved about Dr. Alley's piece was it does move forward past, it dealt with the causes, it dealt with some of the likely consequences, but it offered so many solutions. And I think that's where we just need to go, to be open to solutions, to explore what they are. And use
If I can chip in with a slightly different angle on this. One of the problems is this expectation that the economy is going to keep growing. It was mentioned earlier, right at the beginning of the film, the video, that we expect by 2050 to have an economy that's at least 25 to 50, depending on what you do it, using the more energy than today. And the expectation of the world is that we can keep doing that, keep increasing the amount of energy we use. And one of the things that was in the film was this question about energy efficiency. Okay, we can save a heck of a lot of energy by taking certain measures. And the question that has arisen in this respect is, okay, if we're going to limit emissions, we have to eventually do something with limiting energy. And energy efficiency is not necessarily going to get us where we want. Because the problem with that is, if you, let's say, save 25% of energy in one activity, are you going to be satisfied with having that 25% reduction in, let's say, emissions? Or are you going to say, oh, I saved so much energy over here, I'm going to go out and do something on this side and just go back in and jack up the amount of energy I use in some other way. So being energy efficient is fine, but I mean, it's only fine if you actually limit or cap the amount of energy you're going to need in an absolute sense. And the cap and trade policies, which are in place now, they are not really dealing with the absolute levels. They're just trading between one sector to another. So you've got to be really careful about where you do this. And if we're going to be serious about it, there's got to be some real limits to carbon use.
Dr. Alley?
Yeah. There is a vast body of scholarship that shows that we are economically better off if we deal with this than if we pretend that it's a lie. If you like money, dealing with information and using it makes you richer. And that's the most optimistic thing I can say, because the people in business eventually are going to realize this. They are throwing away money by pretending that I'm a liar and that the other speakers here are liars. And they know. The businesses have known for a very long time that this is real. There are lots of interesting things you can do. And let me do one for you, if I may. We tax alcohol. And we do that to raise money for the government and to reduce drink tobacco and to reduce smoking. And we tax your paycheck. And we do that to raise money for the government and to reduce working. And the economists say, suppose we tax carbon and we didn't tax your paycheck. as much, what would it do to the economy? And the answer is, if you switch from taxing wages to taxing carbon, the economy probably grows faster. And businesses get that too. So there are things, that's a very Republican plan, by the way. It's being promoted by former Representative Inglis and many others. But that's a very Republican plan for how to make the economy bigger, is switch from taxing wages to taxing carbon. Tax things we don't like, not things we do.
Thank you. Another question from the audience. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Carolyn Alpron, and I'm from Columbia, Missouri. And I'm a marketing professional, so I've been thinking about trying to win the hearts and minds of the American public, who does have some small influence over our government. And so I was very interested that you were able to run a new special. Since I'm from Columbia, I didn't get to see it, but I'm sure. So my questions are, how did you have any trouble? I have a two-part question. Did you have any trouble with management and getting them to agree to let you run that? And then the second question is if we wanted to try and influence TV stations in other parts of the country to run specials, is that something that people can, tell the TV station, hey, we'd like you to run this, and would that have any influence?
Well, you're going to be shocked by this, because I know I was. They were just looking for a special. They came to us in late July, and they said, we'd like you guys to do a weather special on whatever. And we had been asking to do a weather special, on a season-to-season basis. It would be different, of course, but we're giving some thoughts to a severe weather special right now. We would run maybe in February. But I immediately threw out the idea, let's do one on climate change. And they didn't even blink. Okay, this is fine. And I have to say, we were at a point where we were very short on producers. Bree Smith had gone out on maternity leave. There just weren't very many bodies. So I did the lion's share of the research and the interviews, and then Cindy and I kind of picked up on it, and we just basically drove this till we were 2 weeks away, and then the producer we needed became involved in that last week and a half before the special aired. By then, I'd done all the interviews, logged all the interviews, we built the frame for the whole thing, and we were getting basically that we're now writing the thing, and my producer came to me and she said, Mike, where's the other side of this? And I said, there is no other side. People think these news departments are, I feel like a big projection screen. My liberal friends think I'm too conservative. My conservative friends think I'm too liberal. But I tell you, in a newsroom, we really do try to be balanced. And Heather said, look, I can't, I'm not comfortable with this. And I said, my news director, Mike Shipley, I said, go talk to Mike. And if he wants us to go in a different direction, I'm totally on board with that. And I'm not kidding, she was back in 10 minutes. And she said, I guess we're going. But to me, where we are on this issue is where news departments must have been in 1963 with the connection between lung cancer and cigarette smoke. And there's no other side to it. There just isn't. Not really. And so that's how I won't kid you, it was a terrifying, once we finally had the thing put together, and then we're moving in the direction of the day of the special, only then did I start to think, what in the world have we done? Because, let's face it, there's a very well-organized effort to combat this story, but we just didn't get it. We didn't get it, and And in answer to the question about what would you do in Columbia, just say, you know, the NBC station in St. Louis did it. They had some pretty good feedback from it. What would you guys think of doing? But specials are hard to do, and they do cost time and money, not only to produce, but then you're conceding a half an hour of something that might make more money by having higher ratings. It's not altogether that feasible, but I would certainly give them a call. You know, I have to say, in our business, we want people to like us. we want people to watch us. There are very few businesses. When you decide that you're going to go to the grocery store and you go to Geerberg's, and if you have an unpleasant experience, not that you would, but if you did, but it's too late. You're at Geerberg's, you know. But with me, if they don't like my socks, just my socks are okay today, but just change the channel. So it makes news departments sometimes a little skittish about talking about things that might inspire a lot of angry feelings.
Dr. Alley.
We had a fascinating discussion with a number of TV meteorologists from our area this past summer. And some of them said, if I say something about climate change, 3 people will call my station manager. To my station manager, that is a groundswell of disapproval, and he'll tell me to shut up. So when a hero tells you something about climate change, call your station manager and say, that was great.
That makes sense. I can tell you politicians react to public comment. Mrs. Benegas.
Hello. Thank you, gentlemen. My name is Susan Benegas. And I have a question. I'm pretty involved in global sustainability stuff, but related to our food. So this question primarily is for you, Dr. Alley. The UN report, Livestock Long Shadow, that came out, I think it was 2007, 2009, talking about that the production of livestock really attributes to over 50% of the greenhouse gases. And there's more and more coming out about that. Even a book recently, 10 Billion by Stephen Emmott, who's a scientist with Microsoft, and talking about the world's rising population and higher level of affluence, people eating more animal protein, which causes, degradation of soil, deforestation, and basically that it takes 90% more water, energy, and land to produce animal protein than it does plant-based diets. So what's your opinion related to really how we're producing food and global sustainability? And that would be for everyone too, but Dr. Alley in particular.
Right, so it's very clear that as we eat lower on the food chain, we get healthier and it's easier on the environment in a lot of ways. It is also very clear that if you start the discussion with many people by no more steak, only tofu, the discussion ends right there. That one and the population are probably the 2 hardest discussions to have, where we know the answer, but we also know that it's a very difficult way to go forward. And so sort of moving towards less meat, less reliance on meat, listen to your doctor just a little more, is probably a good place to start. Food is a huge, huge worry. We know already that in St. Louis, outside of St. Louis, there in Missouri, in Kansas, in Nebraska, on a hot day of summer, if you give your plants enough water, enough fertilizer, you keep the weeds away, they're tilled properly, they don't grow very well because it's too hot. Much of our food is grown at temperatures which are above the optimum for the food. And the warmer it gets on those hot days, the less food you get. we have a reasonable probability, if we don't change our behavior, that by late in this century, for much of the Earth, the average summer will be hotter than the hottest summer we have ever seen up to now. So food becomes huge.
Anybody else?
Well, I just think you're looking at China alone, and this is a country that's growing as well, and they're going to be eating more beef. If they eat more beef, they have to have more cattle. If they have more cattle, there's going to be more methane and more. And methane is a greenhouse gas. It's just a very predictable thing. But how do you tell China? No, we had our 20th century. You can't have your 21st century. You can't have the same. So I think it has to be intuitive. It has to be. I think it has to be part of an understanding of a healthier lifestyle for you personally. Now I do think that if you have a longer growing season, and you do, because you have warmer winters, you have we have less snow, more rain. We're not sufficiently killing off the pests. So maybe unquestionably the growing season is longer, and the additional carbon should conceivably help the stuff that's growing out there. But the problem is now there are more pests, and these plants are not as healthy as perhaps they were in the past. So they were easier to attack, to Dr. Alley's point.
The other thing about food is what kind of food do you want and when do you want to eat it? Because one of the problems with food is the non-local growing of food, transporting food around the country, transporting it from distant countries at times of the year when it's not seasonably grown here. That's as big a problem that for ultimately the transportation problem is one of the biggest problems for food. I totally agree with you that beef is the top of the list of expensive things to eat in terms of what it costs to keep cattle alive and so on, and bring them to the table. But the transportation of food, and that's why so many organizations which are going green are going to the model of locally grown food, so sold in local farmers markets, trying to get that sold in the supermarkets. That is absolutely the way to go. Try and cut out the transportation aspect of food growing and food distribution as much as you can. So, that would require a change in lifestyle. If we're not going to eat fruit as much in the winter, and go back to the older style, locally grown food is going to affect our choices. But the question is, that's going to face everybody. These choices are actually going to be there in front of us as we go forward. Because some of this, as the cost of energy is going to go up, the cost of transportation is going to go up. At some point, it will get very expensive to have food brought in to the likes of what we're used to today, I think.
One of the people I talked with was with the Centers for Disease Control, and he said, we're going to have more whole-of-government events, which was a term I hadn't heard before. But it's Katrina, it's Sandy. It's an event that's so large that it takes every part of every wing of the government to just deal with it. We're going to have more of those. So I guess it poses for me the question of, what's going to motivate our change? Are we going to change because we want to? Or are we going to change because there's some series of cataclysmic events, or there's a signature event that forces us, and then we have no choice? But that's a much harder place to come from.
We're getting close to being out of time. I'd like to ask each panelist if they have some final comment they'd like to make. And Mike, we'll start with you.
I just want to thank you for being here. I want to thank you for being open to the idea. And I want to believe that we can motivate change ourselves and not have it initiated pray that hope doesn't float. We don't have a big flood. You know, there's a study from St. Louis University that goes out into the middle of Dr. Pond's study for June, July, and August. It shows for our part of the country, a 1.5-degree increase Celsius in temperatures, while for other parts of the country, it's like 7 or 8 degrees Celsius. And that's because we have more precipitation. It's also forecasting a 20% increase of stream. So if you are looking at something like that, it's sort of suggesting we could have that Chesterfield Valley flood again. And what would happen if we did have a 1993 flood there again? What do you think the number is for commercial investment down in that valley? $50 million?
50 million? I don't think so. It's much more than that. Dr. Crossley?
In the 5 or 6 years since I got involved in this subject, I've seen a huge change. When I first started, no one was talking sustainable energy or the connection between energy and climate. And now it's really very tightly intertwined. And I would say that the changes are coming in society. I mean, the groups like your own groups, what we really need are for people to understand what the scale of the problem is. And I think, these kind of videos, and I thank you, Richard, for your video. It's one of the, certainly the better ones I've seen, and I commend you on giving it. I hope that, it gives us a chance to talk to this audience. But I think that what you need to do is, what is being done is correct. It's going to be a grassroots movement. There's no doubt, because the government is not going to respond itself. The government is too much influenced by lobby groups which are trying to keep the status quo. So I think it has to be a grassroots movement. It has to be done by people who are going to get together, like all of these small communities, say, hey, we've got to go out there and do this for ourselves. And I think that the big advantage is I have business students in my class, and they will ask me the question, what are the opportunities here? And there's a lot of opportunities for new kinds of businesses to prosper. We don't have to keep the businesses exactly the same as they are now. Business changes. So I think there's a huge amount of opportunity here for people to get on board and start accepting the fact that things are in dire straits and we need to do something. But I'm not a pessimist in the sense, the one thing that America's got going for it, it's got a huge amount of land. And if you're going to do renewable energy the way that's been discussed in the film, you need a lot of land. We are a very fortunate country. We have enough desert, well, not the Sahara Desert, but we have those southwest states have enough sunshine to power the whole economy, if it could be organized. We are not short of the power we need. We are short of the current means to exploit that.
Dr. Alley.
Yeah, if we don't deal with this, we face real problems. If we do deal with this in a wise way, we get a bigger economy, we get more jobs, we get greater national security, we get a cleaner environment, we are more consistent with the global rules, and we have the opportunity to power everybody on the planet forever. And you're here, and that's the optimistic thing. Thank you for coming out.
Thank you, Dr. Alley, for joining us from Penn State. We appreciate it very much for you taking your time. Dr. Crossley from St. Louis University, thank you. And thank you for joining us from KSD TV.